Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you all. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. So I go different cities to speak, and it actually feels really good to be in Chicago because I'm very close to home. I don't know if you know this, but I actually grew up in Wisconsin, in Madison, Wisconsin. So it feels like I'm sort of home. So it's really nice to be back. It's nice also to have seasons because I live in California now. So it's kind of just one season. So it's very nice to actually experience fall. So thank you for inviting me. The topic today is a topic that I think is extremely important, and it's a topic that I think is very essential for us to speak about. And it's the topic about the heart. It's the topic which the Prophet ﷺ spoke about in many of his ahadith. One of those ahadith, the Prophet ﷺ says that in the body there's a lump of flesh, and if that lump of flesh is set right, the entire body will be set right. And if that lump of flesh is corrupted, then the entire body will be corrupted, and verily it is the heart. Ibrahim alayhi salam, and the words of Ibrahim alayhi salam in the Quran, which were recited today, Ibrahim alayhi salam spoke about the Day of Judgment in the Quran, in which he, in his dua, says, يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. The meaning of this ayah is that he's talking about the Day of Judgment, and he says that on this day, men, which is wealth, and banun, children, that neither wealth nor children will avail anyone, will help or benefit anyone. إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. So there are a lot of things in this life that we collect. There are a lot of things in this life that we think are important. We collect wealth, we collect status, we collect likes on Facebook, we collect, degrees. We collect a lot of things, and these things are considered important. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran that none of these types of things which we collect in this life are going to matter on the Day of Judgment. And there's only one thing that's going to matter, and that is إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. The only thing that's going to matter, it's going to avail you on the Day of Judgment, is the one who comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a qalb, with a heart that is salim, with a heart that is sound, with a heart that is sound. And so the question is, what is a qalb salim? What is the meaning of qalb salim? And that's what I want to talk about today. A qalb that is salim is a heart which is devoid of anything that contradicts the tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a heart that is free of any equal or any partner with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a heart that's free of any sort of shirk. Now it's important that we understand that shirk is not just, a lot of times we grow up understanding shirk as worshipping or praying to a statue, or as long as we don't say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has any son, then we haven't committed shirk. But we have to understand that shirk at its essential level is beyond that. Shirk is putting a partner with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at any level, and that includes at the level of love, and it includes at the level of fear. So if we love something like we should only love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's a form of shirk. That's a shirk in love. If we fear something like we should only fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's a shirk in fear. And so a qalb that is salim is a heart that is free of any of those other objects of worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now there's essentially two places that we can hold things. Okay? When we have a lot of things in our life. We have a lot of gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us. He gives us our health, He gives us our youth, He gives us people in our lives, He gives us wealth. These are all gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we love to have gifts. But there are two places where you can hold a gift. You can either hold something in your hand, or you can hold something in your heart. And what I mean by that, the things that we hold in our hands are things that we love to have. Like I said, we have all these gifts that we love. But a gift that is held in the hand is something that is not essential for my existence. It's something that I love to have, but I can live without. Something that is held in the heart is an object of ultimate attachment. And the thing that is held in the heart, I cannot live without. So what I mean by this is that whatever we hold in our heart are those things which, if they're taken away from us, we cannot go on. It's the things that we depend on at a very fundamental level. So when things are taken away, so we know that this life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for example, in Surah Al-Asr, that إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ, that indeed mankind is in a state of loss. We know that in this life, we're constantly losing things, right? Everything is going towards loss. So for example, we have time, but time is, we're losing time, right? We have health, but we're losing our health with every moment that we live. We have life, but we're losing our life with every moment that goes on. And so we're constantly in a state of loss. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this surah says that there is a group of people who are exempt from this loss. It says, إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. So there's a very fundamental truth here, and that is the fact that we are in a constant state of loss. Except, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, except one group of people, and they have 4 characteristics. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, except for the people who have faith. وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, and do righteous deeds. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ, and they enjoin one another to truth, and they enjoin one another to sabr, to patience and constancy. The idea here is that if we are in this category, then the things that we have, we're not losing. What does that mean? When I act for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when I give for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that which I give, I'm not actually losing. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala it's with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I will get it back. I will get it back in one form or another in this life or in the next. So when I have something of this life, any of these gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we said there's our youth, there's the people we love, there's our wealth, all of these things. If I'm holding these things in my heart, then what happens when I lose it? What happens when I lose something that is held in the heart, something that I am dependent upon? That's when you shatter. That's when you can't go on. So this is a situation of somebody, one classic example is like Romeo and Juliet, right? Romeo and Juliet, it's one thing to love somebody, right? But with Romeo and Juliet, when one of them died, or they thought one of them died, the other one didn't want to exist anymore, right? There was no more reason to live. And this is because the object of ultimate attachment was this other person. And so this other person became like an object of worship. And that's because it was something that was held in the heart and not in the hand. Now when something is, like I said, one of these gifts is held in the hand, this is like, if I love, obviously we love to have wealth. We love to have, we want to have a good college degree, a nice house. All of these types of things are things we love to have. But the problem is, if that thing is taken away from me and I was attached to it, that's when I feel that pain of the heart. And the pain of the heart isn't like the pain of the hand. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He warns us against taking anything and putting it at the level that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَا تَدْعُوا مَعَ اللَّهِ إِلَهًا آخَرَ فَتَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُعَذَّبِينَ. Okay, so this ayah, the translation, I'll read the translation and then I'll talk about the ayah. The translation says, do not call on another ilah other than Allah, or you will be among the tormented. So I've translated everything in this ayah except the word ilah. Do not call on another ilah other than Allah, or you will be among the tormented. So the question is, what is the meaning of ilah? And this, as Muslims, is a very essential question, because what is it that makes us a Muslim? It's the shahada, right? We say, La ilaha illallah. So we need to understand what this means, because what we're saying every single day of our life and with our hearts is, there is no ilah except for God. So we need to understand what an ilah really is. Now, if you take this word ilah, you can break it up. Every Arabic word can be broken up into 3 root letters. And ilah is alif, lam, ha. And alif, lam, ha, the connotation and the different derivations of the meaning are as such. One of them is achieved peace and mental calm by seeking refuge with someone or establishing relations with him. Second meaning, become frightened of some impending mishap or disaster, and someone gave him the necessary shelter. Third, turning to another eagerly due to the intensity of his feeling for him. Fourth, the lost offspring of the she-camel rushed to snuggle up to its mother on finding it, became hidden or concealed, also get elevated. And lastly, adored or offered worship to. Now let's go back to the ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, do not call on anyone else as an ilah other than him. Now if we look at the meaning of ilah that we just talked about, it gives you a sense of something that you go to for shelter, something that you go to for ultimate refuge. So what is this telling us? Well, at some level, it's telling you that if you seek shelter or refuge from anything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it will be a source of torment for you. So this is talking about, and this is something we can look at in our own lives, in the lives of those around us, that whenever you are, you're too dependent on something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're too dependent on another person, you're too dependent on your wealth, you're too dependent on your own intellect, anything that you go to for ultimate shelter or refuge other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what does it do? It will let you down. It will disappoint. And there's a reason why this happens. One of the reasons why this happens is that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can carry that weight. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can carry our weight. We can only depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala completely. If we try to depend on anything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala completely, it will break and it will let us down. And eventually when it breaks, what happens to us? We fall. And one of the examples that I like to give is like if you think about someone who's climbing, like someone's climbing a cliff, all right? And if you think about as you're climbing, you hold on to a twig. What's going to happen to that twig is it's going to break. And this is just the laws of the universe, right? Laws of physics, it's going to break. What happens when it breaks? Gravity tells you that you're going to fall. And this is exactly the same thing. When we try to hold on to something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's a handhold that will break, by definition. Because only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the handhold that never breaks. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us this in Surah Al-Baqarah, that whoever holds on to the handhold of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's the only one that never breaks. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us this. And one way to understand this ayah is just at the surface to say that, yes, if you worship something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there will be punishment in the hereafter. But I think that there's more to, the understanding is deeper than just that. We can see even in our life today that the torment will be today, anytime we put something in our heart where only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be. So this is, for example, you'll find that thing which causes you the most pain in your life is going to be that thing which you've put in your heart instead of your hand. So if you sit and you think about your own life and you reflect on your own struggles and your own pain, and you think about what is that thing which has caused me the most grief in my life, that has caused me the most torment, you will find that it is that thing which is in your heart when it really should be in your hand. And only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be at that level where we put our complete dependence on, that we go to for complete refuge and shelter. When you try to go to anything else, and this is usually, if I'm talking to sisters, I'm going to say when you try to go to other people, because that's what we do. We go to other people, and maybe sometimes one of the things that I've noticed is that we as women, we tend to depend too much on other people, and we tend to put so much of our own self-worth and our own, like our happiness is very much defined by our relationships with other people. And I think that for men, again, this is just generally what I've noticed, a lot of times men tend to depend on themselves. And both of these are a problem, because whether I'm depending on myself or I'm depending on other people, they are both creations, and they are both flawed. I cannot depend on myself, and I cannot depend on other people. I can only depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because at the end of the day, whether it's me, my own intellect, my money, my friends, my spouse, my children, they're all creations. And the creation is by definition weak and by definition flawed, and only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can be depended on in this way. One of the beautiful sayings of Ibn Ata'illah is that he says, your creation, Ya Ilahi, O my Lord, your creation has pushed me to your door, and knowledge of your generosity has kept me at your door. So I'm going to reflect on this statement for a second. How does the creation push us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Well, there are a couple ways. One of the ways that the creation pushes us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Allah has made the creation to be beautiful from the outside. The creation is beautiful. So, for example, the sun, it's beautiful, right? A sunset is beautiful. Stars are beautiful. Clouds are beautiful. Human beings are beautiful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the creation beautiful, and this is intended for a very specific reason. It's intended to bring us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Indeed, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the alteration of night and day, are signs for those who reflect. So all of this beauty that's in the universe is there for a reason. It's there to push us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you see something beautiful, it's supposed to make you think, imagine, if this is so beautiful, and this is just a reflection, what does the source, what could the source be like? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the source of beauty. So imagine when you see, a sunset, and you see its beauty, imagine what the source is like. It's intended for that reason, to show us the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to lead us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's one way that the creation brings us to the Creator. But there's another way, another subtle way that the creation brings us to the creation. And that is when we get too close to it. When you try to get too close to the creation, what happens? Well, let's look at a couple examples. A candle. A candle, fire, right? Candles are beautiful, right? You decorate your house with them. But what happens when you try to get too close to a candle? It'll burn you. Okay? The ocean. The ocean is very beautiful. And I can tell you, I live in Southern California. The ocean is beautiful, but it's only beautiful from the shore. What happens if you get too close to the ocean? It'll drown you. Stars. They're beautiful from far away, but what is a star really? Right? I mean, you can't get too close to a star. Think about the sun. The sun is beautiful from far away, but if the sun were just, we talk about if the sun were just a tiny bit closer to us, what would happen to us? The idea here is that the creation is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the creation in such a way that if you try to get too close to the creation, if you try sort of that oneness, if you try to get too close, it will push you away. Now let's talk about human beings. Human beings are beautiful, but what happens when you try to get too close to another human being? What happens when you depend too much on another human being? Well, anyone who's done it can answer that question. That's when they hurt you, right? That's when, they let you down. Ultimately, this is to show us, this is to push us to who? To Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anytime you get too close to the creation, it's as if when you're walking on this path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you start to kind of veer off, right? You start to maybe love something else as you should only love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or you start to love something as much as you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does it do? It stings you. And in that way, it pushes you back. It pushes you back onto the path and tells you you're not there yet, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the end goal, not the creation. So anytime we take the creation as our end, this is when we get hurt. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created everything in such a way that its purpose is to bring us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The purpose of every single thing around us is to bring us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a really revolutionary way to think about the universe, by the way. And this includes everything in your life. This includes every event in your life. This includes every emotion that you've ever felt. It includes every single thing that you've gotten, everything that you've lost. Think about your life in this way, that everything in your life, every emotion, every loss, every gain, is intended to bring you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if it does bring you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it's done its purpose and it's good for you. And if it takes you away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it has not done its purpose. So this is how we have to see everything in our life. And this includes pain, by the way. This includes sadness. This includes loss. When you're in a hardship, that hardship is intended to bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the reason why you're in that hardship. It's supposed to make you depend more on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A lot of us, when we pray, we have trouble focusing, right? We think about all different types of things. Which, by the way, if you want to know what is your strongest attachment, or what are some things that might compete with the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ask yourself what it is that you think about most. What is it that you think about while you're praying? What is it that you go to bed thinking about, you wake up in the morning think about all day, think about while you're praying? These are kind of pointers to tell you what are the things that are most important to you. Now, if we take every single thing that happens in our life and it brings us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it's good for us. Now I want you guys to think for a second about what happens when there's a storm. When there's a storm, that's when you go and you seek shelter. So when you guys think about your salah, for example, most of the time all of us have trouble focusing on our salah. But what about the time when you were going through a really difficult time? When you were, something was going on in your life and it was very painful, you lost something, you were very scared of something, you were very worried. Basically, the storm in your life. How is your salah then? Usually when we go through hardships, that's when we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more intensely. We're able, now all of a sudden, our salah, we have great khushu' in our salah, right? In fact, we've never prayed like that before. And when we make dua with all of our heart because we are desperate. So you see there's a blessing in hardship. And that blessing is that it brings us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And now think about this. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to get closer to Him, one of the ways is to send a hardship. Because look at how we react in hardship. This is when we become closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you think about the example of a storm, when the storm hits, that's when we look for shelter, right? But when it's nice weather, it's sunny, nobody's going to look for shelter. It's only when there's a tornado that you're going to go look for shelter. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually, in His mercy, out of His mercy, sometimes He sends storms so that we will seek shelter in Him. And something else happens when the storm hits. We might try to seek shelter in something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We might try to go to a friend, or we might try to, depend on ourselves. We might try to depend on our status, our wealth, anything else. What happens is that thing it will close. It's like the door will be kept closed. And we'll try door after door after door. And we'll keep, we try everything else, and then finally when every other door is closed, then we go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? We have a problem, so we're faced with something. The first thing we do, we go to the creation. We go to, let me do this. And we go to every other door other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But look at Allah's mercy. When you've tried to do that in your life, what happens? Usually those doors, you keep knocking, no one's opening, right? Or it closes. You go to another door, it's closed. You go to another door, it's closed. What is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doing here? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is protecting us so that we'll go to the correct door, which is Him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because behind every other door is a drop. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sometimes keeps those doors closed in order to protect us and to make us go to the correct door, which is Him. Now, one of the things that we say at least 17 times a day in Surah Al-Fatiha is إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. Actually, we say it more than that. Because, well, yes, we say it at least 17 times. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. This is Surah Al-Fatiha, and the meaning of this is you alone do we worship, and you alone do we seek help. From you alone do we seek help. Now let's look at this statement for a second. We are supposed to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is the end, He is the goal, and then He's also the shelter. But sometimes we separate between these two statements. Sometimes we say إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ without إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. What does this mean? It means that we know that we should worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we don't actually seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's help or we don't actually realize that we need Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to worship Him. What does this mean? It means that, for example, I see that I should worship Allah, so then I do a lot of good deeds, but then I start to depend on my good deeds. I start to depend on my deeds instead of depending on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second thing is when I say إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ without إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ. This is the case where I seek Allah as kind of like a tool. So you know how sometimes, if you want to do really well, you want to marry somebody, a particular person, or you want to do really well on an exam. So what do? You make dua, right? We make dua, and this is great, we're making dua, but basically what we want, our end, is that marry that person, or get this good grade. We use Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a tool. Our goal is not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our goal is this thing in dunya, and we use Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to get there. So we're using Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we're not realizing that Allah is the end. Allah is the goal Himself. Now there's something very dangerous that happens, and many of us fall into this trap. And that is that we focus on the deeds instead of focusing on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What happens when we do this is, I think, three traps that we fall into. One of the traps happens when we see the deed as good. So this is a situation where I'm trying to be, more religious, I'm worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I look at my deeds, and I see my deeds as good. If I'm focusing on the deed instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what tends to happen is I become arrogant. This is when I become self-righteous. When somebody starts to sort of become more religious, and then now they're looking down on everybody else. So the reason why this happens is because I'm seeing my deeds instead of seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's right over me. If I were looking at Allah, if I were seeing and focusing on Allah's greatness, I would never be pleased with my deeds, because I know that my deeds are never good enough for Him. I know that there's no possible way for me to worship Allah as He is His right to be worshipped. So if my focus is on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I can never become pleased with my deeds, and I won't become arrogant, and I won't look down on other people. Similarly, I'll realize that if I am doing good deeds, it's not from me. It's actually a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so if I look at it in this way, then I don't become overconfident, I don't look down on other people, because I realize that it's a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the second situation that happens is when I'm focusing on the deed instead of Allah, and the deed is not good. I've committed a sin. Now if all of my focus is on the sin instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what happens? This is when I fall into despair. This is when I lose hope. And the reason why we lose hope when we commit sins is because we're looking at the sin instead of looking at the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we looked at the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we would see that no amount of sin could ever outweigh the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then lastly, I think the other trap that we fall into, when we look at the deed instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that we minimize the sin itself. What I mean is that when I look at, I see the sin and I say, oh, it's not that big of a deal. But what I really should be doing, instead of looking at the smallness of the sin, I should be looking at the greatness of the one who I'm sinning against. Instead of focusing on the sin, the smallness of the sin, I should focus on the greatness of the one who I'm sinning against. Now what this does is it creates a balance between fear and hope. So we're warned against falling into despair, but we're also warned against getting too complacent, right? I'm okay. I'm doing good. I'm going into Jannah. Because we know that even the greatest companions felt that, Abu Bakr radiallahu anh said that even if he had 1 foot in Jannah, he'd still worry that he might not enter it. And we know that the Prophet ﷺ told his companions that no human being will enter Jannah by their deeds. And when they asked him, even you, O Rasulullah, he said, yes, even me, that we only enter Jannah by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we should never lose hope in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our dependence and our hope should be in Allah, not in our deeds. Because our deeds aren't enough. Our deeds will not take us to, if the deeds of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ aren't going to take him to Jannah, how are my deeds going to take him to Jannah? I do the deeds hoping for the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now one other thing I want to warn you and myself of is what you allow to enter into your heart. The Prophet ﷺ tells us that in the hereafter, you will be with those you love. So the warning here is be careful who you love. Be careful what you love. Because you will be with those you love. Something to think about. The other message that I want us, inshallah, to take home is that we will die in the way that we lived. We will die the way that we lived. A lot of us think, for example, that we'll live our lives however we want, and then right at the last moment before we die, we'll just say La ilaha illallah and everything will be okay. But here's the problem with that thinking. And I'm gonna sort of illustrate this with a story. This was a story of an accountant. I read it somewhere, and it was just very disturbing for me. This was an accountant, and at the time of his death, the only thing that he could say was numbers. Like he just kept on counting numbers, adding numbers. This is at the time of death. Why is this happening? Why is it that the only thing that can come out of his mouth is numbers? It's because the only thing that filled his mind and his heart while he was alive was numbers, was money, was wealth. So we think that we'll live however we want and then say La ilaha illallah at the time of death. But at the time of death, the tongue cannot speak except what the heart commands. Whatever is in the heart will come out. If that heart was full only of dunya, that will speak. If the heart was full of love of status, love of wealth, love of the creation over the creator, it is that which will speak. If the heart was full of grudges, jealousy, hatred, that will speak. But if it was full of the love of Allah, then that will speak. If in your life your heart carried only La ilaha illallah, that truly there is no refuge, no shelter, no deity worthy of worship but Him, then and only then will the tongue be given permission to say, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah, Allahumma ja'alna minhum, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.